The Boneyard. Short Fictions of the Morbid and Macabre. Volume 2. Written by Jonathan Dunne. Narrated for you by the author. The Formaldehyde Fiend. The stranger arrived in the town of Rathmore as the leaves began to turn red and a brisk breeze whistled from the north. No one knew his name. Nobody knew it, because he never gave it. Those who met him called him the Gent. Those who never met him called him the Formaldehyde Fiend. It was only after the strange series of deaths that the women, fortunate or perhaps unfortunate, enough to have met him and survived, agreed the Gent was the perfect moniker for that enigmatic, creeping man, cold and smooth as ice and slippery slick as oil. Every gauged word that came from his lips fell in all the right places in the women's hearts. The newcomer was an impeccable dresser, in dark charcoal, always shiny shoes that never got scuffed no matter where he was coming from, and a voice like silk to the inner ear. He was not young, nor was he old. The Gent was timeless, and age was not even something he spoke to, the impression being more like time just passed around him. The nickname, the Formaldehyde Fiend, first surfaced online, mostly on conspiracy theory websites. The Gent brought his proposal to the lovely ones, as he liked to call them. The predator found them in bookstores, waylaid them in cafes, accosted them on poorly lit streets, never laying a finger on them, but always posing the same question. "Would you like to be forever beautiful, my dear?" Followed up with the same vow. "Follow me, and I shall grant you that wish. I pickle youth in a jar of formaldehyde." Some laughed at his strange words, but he never smiled, not once. Others giggled nervously and walked away. But some hesitated. And those who hesitated were presented with a business card, of all things, given to them in a leather-gloved hand. It was this business-like approach that disarmed the lovely ones, and gave the odd man a sense of credibility. There was something in him that caused them trepidation. Was it the resonance of his voice, the utter conviction in his eyes, the way he regarded them, not with hunger, not with lust, but adoration? As if he were offering something sacred on that business card with the catchy header, "Pickled Youth in a jar of formaldehyde." Of course, we have all this information in hindsight. None of this was known while he was in town. It was only when the survivors privately met up for a weekend on the coast and shared their stories by the fire. That was when it became apparent that the Gent used the very same words and gestures with each of them, executing the business card move at exactly the same moment. And yes, he held it out to them between his index and middle fingers of his gloved hand. They shared something else, survivor's guilt. Ironic, considering the Gent's method for eternal beauty. And something else became clear when this group of women decided to meet. They all shared the same age. Among those women was the woman who worked on the case, Police Detective Sandra Lonergan, and she had the closest call with the Gent. It was, they concluded, a very strategic 35 years old. This was the age when this particular group of women began to notice the first signs of aging in their mirror on the wall. Some women were more superficial than others in the group of 10, but one thing was for sure, they all shared aging. And those first grey hairs and lines under the eyes played on all their minds, no matter how nonchalant they tried to appear to the outside world about growing old. That vegetating state niggled at their aging bones, and Christ, but if they didn't think about their youth in a jar of formaldehyde when presented with the business card. The first to follow him was Claire Rafferty. Unfortunately for Claire, she wasn't one of the women present at the survivors' meeting. Being a former Miss Ireland, Claire had never been anything but beautiful. Her beauty had always opened doors, and that same beauty would close the last door. Recently she had started to see things in her ensuite bathroom mirror. 1 or 2 grey hairs. She would pluck one out and 2 would grow in its place. A vicious circle, if ever there was one. Crow's feet had sprung up overnight at the corners of her eyes, stubborn against even the most miraculous of creams. Fatigue crept into her skin like a slow but deadly virus with no cure, only death. She had met the gent in the cafe in Rathmore's town square on a wintry dark evening. When he made his proposal and slipped her his business card, Claire had leaned forward and asked in a low voice, "How can you do something even God can't do? Nobody can turn back the clock." "Come with me," he beckoned, "and you'll see for yourself. We won't turn back the clock, but we will stop it." Those ominous words should have given the former Miss Ireland pause for thought, but Claire was about to start her own chat show on morning TV, and she needed to look her best. She didn't hesitate for even a moment before following him into the darkness. The next morning she was found dead in the park, lifeless at the base of the giant weeping willow. Claire Rafferty was dead, yes, but she was different. Her skin, cold and pale, was flawless, as if sculpted from the purest marble. Claire's lips, still red, looked as if they had just been kissed. Her hair shone like gold in the morning sun. Her eyes, though glassy and blind, were filled with a look of ecstasy, of unspeakable joy. Whatever she had experienced before death took her had been immortalized in the same death, and she was beautiful. Forever so. The coroner couldn't explain it. No struggle, no wound, no mark upon her body. Nothing. It was as if she'd simply stopped. The state pathologist had never seen anything like it. She would go on to say that Claire reminded her of a shopfront mannequin with that strangely lifeless smile. Not only the medical experts, the survivors themselves never found out the method for immortalizing the other women. And thank God, because if they were privy to the gent's method of immortalization, then they wouldn't be here to tell their story to the world. It was a macabre catch-22 situation. But they all had one thing clear. They preferred not knowing how, exactly, the gent pickled youth in formaldehyde. Rafferty's death spread through Rathmore like wildfire. The townspeople made doubly sure to lock their doors and windows at night. No key was left unturned. A shroud of strange stillness came down over the town. But the whole place went into shutdown exactly 1 week after finding Claire Rafferty's perfectly deceased body, when Olivia Henderson turned up in the same park, lifeless, beneath the drooping branches of the willow tree, weeping for her passing. If only there was a way to get that enormous old tree to reveal its secrets. Olivia had a beautiful smile on her pale face, immortalized by rigor mortis. Again, just like her deceased predecessor, the state pathologist and coroner could not decipher the cause of death. The Henderson woman had just stopped. Those poignant words had come from the baffled coroner. Rathmore was on high alert. On the streets, locals eyed each other with a newfound suspicion. Nobody walked alone, especially after dark, and locals always moved in huddled groups. On Claire Rafferty's 2-week death anniversary and Olivia Henderson's 1-week anniversary, more women, Rachel McCoy and Sophie O'Neill, were found reposing beneath the weeping willow in the already taped-off town park. Once again, no cause of death, but their smiling faces of utter peace and tranquility spoke from beyond the grave. One didn't need a PhD in forensics to see that the women had passed in a strange state of bliss, and that was the very word used by the highly experienced state pathologist. But this time something was found in Sophie O'Neill's coat pocket. A business card. But it was the most unusual business card the authorities had ever seen, not only because of the service it offered, pickled youth in a jar of formaldehyde, but the fact that there was no contact information on the card, leading them to believe that the card was personally given to the O'Neill woman and she didn't need any contact info. Any information was face-to-face and verbal. That was when they realized they were dealing with the most cunning of foxes. One of the detectives, a woman calling herself Sandra Lonergan, noted that just because nothing was visible on the curious business card didn't mean there was nothing invisible, like DNA. The card was sent to the lab for analysis. The results only deepened the mystery. Trace DNA belonging to Sophie O'Neill was present, but only hers. The local police in Rathmore were held to scrutiny and intense questioning regarding the string of deaths. The police commissioner personally came down from his office in the capital to inspect the unusual murders and put pressure on the local detectives working the case. They had to be seen to be doing something right. The town of Rathmore was suspended in time for the next 9 days, until one of the detectives, the same Sandra Lonergan who had sent the business card found in Sophie O'Neill's coat pocket for DNA analysis, was in a local cafe. She was sitting at the counter, sipping a late-evening cafe latte and reviewing the crime scene photos on her laptop when she glanced around at the other patrons. Her gaze landed on a group of 3 pretty women seated in the far right corner. Sandra looked back at the screen, at the 4 faces of death. They looked just like the women at that table. No one would ever say they were dead, just peacefully asleep, and Sandra had a light bulb moment. She turned to the young man behind the counter, who was busy preparing drinks and light food. "Excuse me." He looked up at her and smiled. "Yeah, can I help you?" She discreetly flashed her police badge. "Have you seen anyone in here acting unusual lately?" The barista raised his eyebrows and gestured to 3 young student types sitting by the street window, making funny faces at passers-by as they gulped their smoothies. "You mean that kind of unusual?" Sandra giggled. "No, I was thinking something more—" She struggled for the right word. "I don't know, something more, something less than that. They're annoying, yes, but harmless. I would probably be sitting in the middle of them if I were their age again." Sandra apologized for the vagueness and clarified. "Maybe a stranger you haven't seen before, but subtle, not like those kids. Very possibly a lone male." She corrected her cop talk. "A guy, just on his own. He might have been loitering near female customers. Just off. Leery, but not enough to cause a scene. The kind of guy who almost stands out, though you can't say why. Maybe at the time you wouldn't have picked him out of the crowd, but later something about him gnaws at the back of your mind. A presence your subconscious clocked, even if you didn't at the time." She paused, realizing she had gone a little overboard. "Does any of this sound familiar at all?" The barista grew pensive as he prepared a delicious beef and chutney sandwich. "Well, it's just like you say. At the time, he didn't strike me as odd because I was busy, and I might have picked up on something on a subconscious level, and—" "Go on." Sandra was growing excited. There is someone. Myself and the guys behind the counter have noticed him on a few occasions over the last few weeks. A female customer complained about him. By the time we got to his table, he was gone. We probably would have overlooked him, only for the fact that he'd never ordered anything to eat or drink. Just came in here, loitering. We'd been warned about people like that." Sandra briefly questioned why a kid working behind the counter at the local cafe knew more than the enormous task force working on this case. She cringed, realizing that nobody in her team had questioned the staff here in a cafe that had a full view of the town square, and more importantly, was on full view in the town square with big windows. Nobody would realize they were being watched from outside. "Uh-huh. I have seen him here on a few occasions over the last few weeks, and he always comes in a few minutes before we're closing." Interest piqued. The police detective glanced at her watch. "What time do you close?" The worker pointed at a sign on the wall by her head. "Oh, right. So much for my detective skills. We're always supposed to be aware of our surroundings, you know." She smiled. but the smile left her face when she saw that the place was closing in 15 minutes. In theory, this mystery man could possibly walk through the front door any second. A shard of icy dread skittered through her frame as she eyed the door, imagining the hunchbacked, formaldehyde-pickling monster dragging itself into the cafe. "Oh, we have cameras." The barista pointed at a single camera down at the far end of the cafe, tucked neatly up into the right-hand corner by the ceiling. "Good. Do you think I could have a look at the footage?" But there wouldn't be any need to trawl through the footage because at exactly 10 minutes to closing time, the front door opened and a man, a gent, stepped into the cafe. It wasn't the eye-popping fiend of formaldehyde Sandra was expecting, but a sharply dressed individual, shiny black shoes and a long tweed overcoat that reminded her of Tommy Shelby in Peaky Blinders. He stuck out like a tourist in Rathmore. The police detective and barista exchanged a telling glance. The young man picked up on the fact that Sandra wanted him to continue about his business and act as though nothing was out of the ordinary. The newcomer came to the counter and briefly scanned the clientele. His unblinking stare rested on the 3 women in the far corner, getting ready to leave. And Sandra, sitting just to his right, felt the hairs rise in the back of her neck. He reminded her of some kind of predatory animal. The dead look in his eyes gave Sandra unending creeps, and left her stunned. As the stranger slowly turned those lifeless eyes to her, she forgot to breathe just then. "You know who I am." It wasn't a question. "I do," she said. "And I know what you do." "And what would that be?" She said it without thinking. "You pickle youth in formaldehyde." He only stood there, smiling at her brazenly. He knew exactly what she was talking about. She had expected him to lash out, to grab her, to reveal some monstrous nature beneath his polished facade, at least deny her accusation. Nothing. Then it dawned on Sandra that she had just accused a stranger of being the murderer. Not professional. There would be consequences if this got back to her superiors. "I want to know why." "Why?" he echoed, a sparkle of amusement playing on his features. "Because beauty is fleeting, because time is cruel. I offer an escape." Again he did not deny it. "But it is not a bad death. I take nothing they do not freely offer. I give them what they most desire, and in return they are preserved forever, unchanged by time, by sickness, by sorrow, till death do us part." "But they're dead." "Yes," he smiled. "But tell me, are they not beautiful?" "You're a killer." "Jesus, Sandra, get a hold of yourself." But the seething anger was difficult to keep in, and she was boiling now, ready to blow her top off. "No, I'm offering eternal beauty." She swallowed hard. "You need to be stopped." At the same time, the police detective was racking her brain, trying to figure out a way to keep him here. She was here on her own, off duty. She had her phone in her pocket, but she wasn't going to call in for backup in front of him. Maybe she should use the bathroom as an excuse and call from there. As she determined this, her eyes slipped to the knife resting on the plate with the coffee cake and the glass display to the right of where she was sitting. "You think so?" He took a step closer, and the air around him seemed to still. "Then stop me." He looked deep into her eyes, and she found herself floating in them. "Are you jealous that you're not one of the lovely ones?" The police detective snorted in his face. "Jealous? Me? So what you're saying is that a beautiful woman will do anything to hold on to her beauty, even die to preserve herself? Is that what you're really telling me here? Are the lovely ones so superficial, so empty?" He shook his head. "No, far from it. But some will do anything to stop aging. My job is to find the right candidates. And the right candidates are the ones who pause to think when I make my proposal. At this juncture, the police detective thought about her neighbour, Kimberly, who had gone under the knife recently. Facelift. She looked ghastly. Kimberly, Kim for short, looked like one of the mannequins standing in Penny's clothes shop window. She said as much to her husband, John, who agreed wholeheartedly, commenting that it was a sin to ruin her natural pretty face. God is the best plastic surgeon. Her husband's logic was flawed, but Sandra kept that to herself. You can't stop what's forever. He breathed. She knew with rising fear that he was right in a way she preferred not to think about. Then why are you here? Because there will always be those who look for me, he said with that easy, knowing smile, and I will always provide them with the service they are expecting. I pickle youth in a jar of formaldehyde. But you know that already, don't you? She trembled at these words. He knew who she was, but more worryingly, his conviction. It terrified her. In his twisted view of the world, he really was offering a service. I think if you bring those girls back to life, you would find that they wouldn't agree with you. What do you gain from all of this? I cannot answer that question. Let's just say that I work for secret individuals in dark places. He hesitated before asking, would you like to see how I pickle youth in formaldehyde? Sandra paused. And there's the pause I watch for. She felt foolish in this man's cunning hands. It was as if he had been around 1,000 years and knew exactly how to read people. He wasn't denying anything, and that worried her. He was treating this as a business. Now she had a predicament on her hands. If she didn't go with him, she might lose him. But if she went with him, she needed backup. She had to think fast. Meet you outside. I need to use the bathroom. Without reacting, the man left the cafe and stepped outside into the pouring rain. Sandra noticed how he walked into the rainfall and stood there. Any normal-thinking person would stand in the doorway until the shower died down. But hello, she wasn't dealing with any normal-thinking person. While his back was to her, Sandra took those valuable milliseconds to swipe the coffee cake knife from behind the counter and quickly shove it up her left coat sleeve. In that moment of surreal madness, the police detective winced as she imagined the cake cream and icing squelching up along her new white blouse as the blade passed between her coat and blouse sleeves. Yuck. She turned to the barista, who had spotted her hiding the knife and looked very concerned. Call the police, she ordered him. Tell them everything. Tell them Sandra knows the killer. No, I'm offering eternal beauty. And I'm going to buy time until they arrive. An unfortunate turn of phrase considering her immediate circumstances. The young man's eyes were out on stalks now, knowing he'd been within feet of the serial killer prowling their town. Later he would kick himself for not having already cottoned on to that fact. But he would give himself an extra kick for letting the woman, Sandra, the police detective, follow the murderer. Where? The man asked frantically. Sandra Lonergan didn't know where, so she uttered her first and only guess before leaving. The park. Weeping Willow. She went outside to join him. They walked side by side under the streetlights in the pouring rain. Sandra walked as slowly as possible to delay whatever was about to happen. When they got to the end of the street, the individual, who was already becoming the Gent or the Formaldehyde Fiend in the annals of serial killer history, turned to Sandra and handed her a business card. She took it without thinking, once again, playing right into his cunning hands. As the rain cascaded down her face, she read the 7 words in copperplate font. Pickled youth in a jar of formaldehyde. She grew dizzy as the blood drained from her head. Up until now, the police detective had fooled herself into thinking that she wasn't on her own at the end of the street on a dark evening with the elusive formaldehyde killer. I'm offering eternal beauty. She kept telling herself that backup would be there in a flash, any second now. Sandra cringed, knowing she had let her guard down by reaching out for the card. He had used the power of distraction on her, a fucking rookie mistake. And before that had even happened, she heard him say, "I'll give you that. And you, give me this." "Give you what?" And before she knew it, his left gloved hand was removing the icing-smeared knife blade from her left coat sleeve as he handed her his business card between his index and middle fingers of his right gloved hand. "You misplaced this," he said in a dead monotone, a flashing glint of steel. Before terrified Sandra knew what was happening, she felt the cold blade at her neck, slicing through the thin layer of skin and flesh, working on her tendons and jugulars. She felt nothing as her assailant drew the knife blade slowly across her throat, backhanded, from left to right, the fucking coffee cake knife that was somehow belittling right now. But even as the knife drew across her throat, the police detective was vaguely aware that this didn't fit the modus operandi of this self-serving killer who worked for secret individuals in dark places, who left the dead with a smile on their faces. There was that for starters. Having her throat sliced open wasn't going to leave her with a pretty smile. Sandra had seen what a knife can do, and one thing it didn't leave was an eternal smile, rather a horrifying wide-eyed Halloween mask. Every time she looked at a crime scene photo, she couldn't help but stare at the faces of the recently deceased, wondering what their last conscious realization had been as their light went out. Perhaps there was nothing but dumb shock, the brain having already gone into shutdown to help ease the pain, as it were. Sandra's final realization in the seconds before death was this. Either the blade was so sharp she didn't feel it as it sliced clean through her throat, or he'd used the blunt side for some sick, unfunny joke she'd never understand, except to thank her lucky stars she hadn't been one of the lovely ones. The sudden rush of blood to her head told her she was still alive. If her throat had been cut, the crimson stuff would be spilling the other way. A wave of dizziness hit. As she collapsed onto the wet pavement, she caught a final glimpse of the killer slipping into the darkness, beyond the reach of the streetlights. Epilogue. As the years went by, Sandra Lonergan would occasionally look at her greying self in the mirror and daydream about him with his smooth voice and the terrible allure of what he offered. Sometimes she thought she saw him standing there behind her, just over her shoulder, both of them looking at her reflection in the mirror while she asked herself if she had made the wrong choice. Even though she did not want to admit it, there was something to pickling youth in a jar of formaldehyde, and may God strike her down for even thinking so. She'd been retired from the force for 5 years, happily enjoying the quiet life when, on a sultry summer evening, a single knock echoed on her front door. Her heart stopped. Sandra knew before she even opened it. The same black suit, the same ageless face, the same knowing smile. There he was, standing under the light of her front porch. The Gent, a.k.a. the Formaldehyde Fiend. "Hello again," he whispered. "It's been a while." And yes, that oily voice. She didn't speak, couldn't speak. "I am here to give you one last chance," he said, his gentle voice soft like a breeze. "I know you've been having doubts recently. You have lived, you have loved, you have grown old. But time is cruel, and it will take everything back. We can stop it together." For a moment, Sandra actually considered his proposal, then came to her senses. "No. Life's too precious. I don't need a smiling face, frozen in death. Life's about the good, the bad, and everything in between. It's called living." The stranger nodded, turned, and vanished into the night for the second and final time.